All right. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen to give you, first of all, I want to say Happy International Women's Day. I'm very sad that I can't be with you today. I have a knee injury that I'm dealing with, and I'm trying to figure out next steps on that. In the meantime, I think my colleague is the other Amaney, Jamal now. I gave her the link, so that's good. There's not two of me. Today we'll be presenting on women work, MENA women at work and online, in keeping with the theme of the conference, the potential of the digital economy. I'm going to share my screen, and then we'll take it from there. Everybody can see the screen now? Perfect. So just to give you a little bit of background information about the Arab Barometer, the Arab Barometer is the longest standing and largest repository of publicly available data on ordinary citizens' views in the Middle East and North Africa. The Arab Barometer has tracked views of ordinary citizens across MENA since 2006, providing insight into changes over time. Right here. The Arab Barometer goals are to accurately track attitudes and behavior of ordinary citizens, build institutional capacity to conduct survey research, disseminate knowledge about ordinary citizens living in MENA, to inform civil society, government, and international organizations. To date, we have conducted more than 125,000 personal interviews.
This is your presentation.
She's sharing.
Yeah.
You're sharing your desktop, your email.
Sorry. Thank you for pointing that out. Let me just move this back over. Sorry. I wanted to be looking at you directly, and hence, okay, hold on one second. Sorry about that.
We've all done it.
And then of course I didn't think about moving the, we'll get this right. Okay, here we go back. Thank you. I've only been Zooming for what, 4 years now. You think I'm down. Okay. Oh no. Is that better?
Yes.
Excellent. So we've we've done this in 87. We've conducted over 87 national representative surveys. We've conducted 7 waves across 15 countries, providing trend data on how views have changed. And here are like our waves. Wave 1 starting in 2006 through and 7, all the way to wave 7 going into 2021-22 in 12 countries. We are now preparing for wave 8, which we hope to begin conducting this summer. All of our data are open source and publicly available for analysis at arabbarometer.org, and we have an English website and an Arabic website that contains all the materials and information. As we most of the data for today's presentation is coming from wave 7, which we rely on 12 nationally representative surveys of citizens age 18 and above. We conducted more than 26,000 personal interviews in wave 7. All of our interviews are face-to-face in the respondent's place of residence. And we have a complex survey design stratified by governance or governorate and urbanity to capture basically representation. So we again stress that our surveys are nationally representative. They capture what's going on in the entire country. Wave 7 was fielded from October 2021 to July 2022. And our response rate varies anywhere between 17 to 74%. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A. And we work with our local partners in each country. So the key findings, some of the key findings from wave 7 as it pertains to today's conference and the themes of today's conference is women who are employed are better situated economically than self-identified housewives. Employment is more indicative than income of having a bank account in terms of women holding their own resources. Employed women are less likely to experience food insecurity and we know that food insecurity is rising in the region. Structural barriers to workforce participation matter more than cultural barriers, and we'll talk more about this. And so the key point here is oftentimes the cultural explanations or cultural factors are named as factors that are preventing women to access the labor force. What we're showing here is that no, there are indeed other structural factors that are limiting female labor force participation. And we all know that female labor force participation in MENA remains among the lowest globally. Even when you control for level of development or economic development, MENA still is underperforming when it comes to the percentage of women in the labor force. Women in MENA care most about wages and childcare. And so this speaks directly to the wage structure, and it speaks directly to welfare state sort of provisions that, or private sector provisions that might help women on the childcare front. Internet usage among women is determined by access and education. Although there is broad support for women's university education, which has remained constant over time. So although women's human capital in the Middle East and North Africa has increased and is increasing and is quite significant, that doesn't track well with labor force participation. So the importance of employment. If we look at the Middle East and North Africa, I'll try to break down these graphs. The first one here, when we look at the employment status of women in MENA, you'll see that the majority of women are identifying with this category here, which is basic. Women are housewives, and I'm not, I think being what I call a domestic engineer is a very noble job, we all know that many women are multitasking on a daily basis to keep their families afloat. So I'm not trying to sort of suggest that it is an inferior location, but nevertheless, in terms of tracking women's economic empowerment, we don't see that it overlaps well with being a housewife. So in most of the countries, the majority of women are housewives. In Algeria, it's 44%, Egypt, 71%, Iraq, 68%, Jordan, 66%, Lebanon, 54%, Libya, 23%, Mauritania, 42%, Morocco, 53%, Palestine, 72%, Sudan, 42%, and Tunisia, 52%. So the vast majority of women, almost in every single country, except for a few exceptions, are housewives. Very few women report to be employed. Algeria, 21% of women are employed or self-employed or retired. That's like closer to 31%. Egypt, that's 12%. So you see the trend. Kuwait, we see a lot of women working, but most of them are working in the public sector. And we all know that the public sector has done an incredible job creating opportunities for women in the public sector. We can talk more about that, but that's like an exception here. Libya, we see a lot of self-reported employment among women. But in most other countries, it's basically a sheer minority. When we compare the economic situation of women who self-identify as employed versus housewives, this is where we begin to see the separation. So the percent of women saying they can cover their monthly expenses, you'll see that employed or self-employed women, the darker line, in every country, those women report that they are better able to cover their monthly expenses by significant margins. Here it's about 14% separation in Algeria, 16% separation in Morocco, about 17% separation in Libya, and so forth. So again, women who report that they're employed are able to cover their monthly expenses. We also see that they're more likely to report that they hold their own bank account. And again, having that, what does the bank account tell us? It tells us a little bit more about economic autonomy for women. And so you see by tremendous margins, women who are employed or self-employed are more likely to have their own bank accounts versus housewives and who are less likely to do so. And then we also see that women who report having their own bank account, they are also more likely to say that they can cover their expenses. So again, this sort of gives us a better picture of economic empowerment. Women who have jobs are more likely to have their own bank accounts. Women who have their own bank accounts are more likely to be able to cover their expenses. So again, it shows us that economic relationship. Now, when we talk about food insecurity in wave 7, almost when we asked the question of, we worried our food would run out before we got money to buy more. We asked this question in wave 7 of all the citizens in our surveys across the countries. We found that approximately 50% of citizens in MENA reported some form of food insecurity in our last wave. And this is a tremendous sort of escalation. We all know what's going on globally with inflation, with real wages not adjusting to economic pressures or inflation rates. Just every single country almost has a unique set of circumstances that's making the economic situation even more dire than it really was earlier. But when we asked people, we worried our food would run out before we got money to buy more food. When we look at employed versus housewife, you'll see that housewives were more worried about their money running out. So again, on food insecurity, again, the margins aren't tremendous. Maybe in Tunisia, we're seeing very significant margins. Jordan, we're seeing almost like double in terms of housewives versus employed women. But nevertheless, employment seems to also mean that women have a little bit more economic security. And then we asked the question, the food that we bought did not last, and we did not have money to get more. You'll see that housewives on average are reporting more sort of food vulnerability than women who are employed. We know that in Kuwait, we have a large segment of women working in the public sector. Kuwait is unique. It does not sort of reflect what's happening in other Arab countries. That's because it's an oil-rich country. So we'll sort of leave Kuwait aside. But the percent of women who are working, who say they work in the public sector, is still massive in the region. So Iraq, still 67% of employed women are working in the public sector. Libya, 63. Algeria, 60. Sudan, 51. Jordan, 43, Palestine, right? Which really, Palestine has a weak state, but still 40% of women are working in the public sector. This also sort of captures teachers as well. But this gets us back to what we know earlier from history, even as, part of the authoritarian contracts or the social contracts that authoritarian regimes had with their citizens is that the state would be the largest sector of employment, almost to keep citizens happy and at ease, even if countries were less democratic. And as we entered the 1990s into the 2000s, where we began to see more austerity measures, more pressures on governments to privatize, to reduce the size of the public sector, to lead to more economic liberalization and democracy, what we're seeing is that this disproportionately affected women who were let go by the public sectors. So as countries democratize and we're meeting IMF conditionality and World Bank stipulations on how to democratize and liberalize economies, it seems that women fell as casualties because they were let go from the public sectors. It doesn't seem that the private sector is picking up women who wish to participate in the labor force in the region. And again, when we ask people, did you have the ability to cover your monthly expenses, you'll see that the percent of women saying yes, again, we see that a large segment of those women are in Algeria. Remember, Algeria had higher levels of employment. And again, these scores are all tracking with employment patterns. So workforce barriers, we often ask, well, why don't we see more women in the labor force? Even while the human capital of women, their educational levels, in some countries, especially in the Gulf now, the percent of women with degrees of higher education outnumbers men. But we don't see that translate into active labor force participation. So then what are the barriers? So in the Arab Barometer, we asked about everything. We asked, what are the most challenging barriers to entry in the workplace for women? We said, it's socially unacceptable. There is no gender separation. We found in some of our interviews that women said they would be okay to work only if they worked separately from men. They didn't want it to be in this mixed space. So we asked that. Men are given priority, that there's patriarchy and sexism in the workplace and men always get preference. So we asked men given priority. Then we asked about the lack of childcare support, the lack of transportation, low wages, and then don't know. So in some countries, the don't knows were pretty large, but in most countries they weren't. But the one thing that stands out is that in many countries, our shades of orange and gold and brown, light brown, sort of dominate the spectrum. In some countries, the cultural ones here, the patriarchy, the gender the desire for gender separation, the social acceptability, you'll see in Iraq, these factors still matter quite a lot. In Libya, they matter quite a lot. Sorry, with you know, still 22% in Libya saying it's socially unacceptable for women to work. In Palestine, these things matter a lot, with patriarchy being cited as a crucial issue. 22% of Palestinian women, report what men are given priority. You know, we might say that because of the occupation, you know, jobs will go to men because of the cultural expectation that men should be the true breadwinners of families. But nevertheless, these are still huge numbers. But the bigger numbers are on the structural factors, the lack of childcare. 27% in Algeria, 37, almost 40% of Egyptian women say childcare. 40% of Jordanian women reporting this. 29% of Moroccans, 25% of Sudanese, 37% of Tunisians, right? So childcare, right? And we often in our qualitative work, when we talk to women, and we talk to our partners and we sort of try to understand this, women will say repeatedly, why should I go work when my paycheck will not cover my childcare expenses, right? Why should I leave my family and create that disruption when the cost of childcare is going to be more than what I'll earn, especially if you factor in transportation costs and taxis and whatnot. So the issue is that if we really want to think about how labor force participation or to empower women through more labor force participation, it is really incumbent on states and governments and NGOs and even internationals to really start thinking about the role of welfare provision in the way of childcare. And almost you know, the US is not the best example on childcare support for working women, but Europe has done a better job. Historically, when women were employed in the public sector, although the public sector kept wages low, and again, I'm not trying to say let's go back to expanding the public sectors, but what kept women working in the pre-liberalization era, when the public sectors were expanded, is that public sector pensions were very attractive for women. And remember, because women worked in the public sector, most women were let go home around 1:32, 2:30. So most women were going home around the time their kids were being picked up from school. And that was sort of the embedded child care provision for women working in the public sectors in MENA. That no longer is not afforded. So this is something I wanted to emphasize. We can come back to this. And then really quickly, again, when we asked what are the two most common responses to the biggest barriers in the workforce, and we look at the two most common cultural responses, men given priority or socially unacceptable, and low wages and lack of childcare, you'll see that the majority of women across the countries are reporting orange and light brown, which is basically the low wages and the lack of childcare. Really quickly on this, because I know time is of the essence, and I want MaryClare still is going to talk about the digital age. We know that married and previously married women are likely to be employed and have children. Again, we don't see this, if you look at married women, they're more likely to be employed and have women. Most of the singles are still younger or engaged, but more or less women by and large who are working have children. So the majority of women who are married with children are working, which means it's even more incumbent for us to think more creatively around these issues. And unlike a lot of other countries where you have a lot of working women who prioritize career, they might decide not to have children. This is not the case in the Middle East and North Africa. Whether you are a housewife or employed, percent of married or previously married women saying they are housewife or employed who have children, you'll see that if you're a housewife or you're employed, you're almost equally as likely to have children. Again, children are a big part of the culture and society of MENA. Working women have children, housewives have children. So the point is that women who choose to go into the labor force are almost taking on additional responsibilities, full childcare and full employment. Wages are declining, so it seems that the factors are gravitating towards keeping women out of the labor force. And with that, I'm going to transition to my colleague MaryClare so she can talk about women and the digital age. MaryClare, do you want me to keep sharing these slides, or do you want to share your version on your end?
I
think you have
I don't know.
out of my
Sorry.
other one. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I have the same slides on my end.
So I'm gonna then stop sharing. You can take over.
Okay. I am unable to share my video. Would it be possible to? So I can share my screen. I seem to be unable to turn my video on.
Oh,
Thank you, the co-host. Just a minute.
Let's see. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. So I'll pick it up where Amaney stopped. So women in the internet, we have seen since our survey has started, perhaps unsurprisingly, that internet use has drastically increased across the region. We see that really the internet broadband penetration was not, didn't cover much of the country when we first started during Arab Barometer Wave 1, but we are glad we asked about it because, 10, 16 years later, we see everyone is using the internet, and it's a really important tool to consider when we're thinking. We just talked a lot about women and the economy and how childcare is a really big part of that, and so jobs with more flexible hours could certainly be a help, and so the internet could potentially provide a solution on that end. So we actually don't see much of a difference between internet use with men and women. So from this slide, you can see we asked if people use it throughout the day, if people use it once a day or during the week. So there's a degree of variation in which we can really measure internet use and gendered internet use. So for use throughout the day, the difference isn't terribly stark, but when we look at the percent of people saying that they do or don't use the internet, we do see that women are, at least in Egypt, Mauritania, Tunisia, Sudan, which are the countries where more people in general, more citizens in general, are reporting not using the internet, with less access to internet, we see greater gender disparities. And that's continued, that can be emphasized again when we look at rural versus urban areas. So there is less, there tends to be less internet access in rural areas, and where there's less access, we see greater gender differences between internet use throughout the day. So it's a story of access, and it's also a story of employment. So women who report being employed or self-employed are much more likely to say that they use internet throughout the day, whereas women who, again, self-identify as housewives, these are mutually exclusive categories in our survey, women who identify as housewives primarily report really not using the internet throughout the day. This is likely because there's so much more going on, watching the children, taking care of chores, just keeping the, what Dr. Jamal described as, the household economy going. So when we're thinking about how can we engage women in the internet, we do see this disparity between use and familiarity with the internet is really going to affect how likely someone would be to, engage in the economic, the economic opportunities that the internet might provide. And this is further, we see even bigger differences when it comes to education. So women who have above a secondary school education are much more likely to be exposed to the internet, are much more likely to use it throughout the day. And women with at most a secondary education, again, especially in these countries where internet is not as pervasive as elsewhere, in Egypt and Sudan and Mauritania, Tunisia, these are the same countries where we saw the gender disparities in people who are not, in citizens who are not using the internet. And we're seeing, again, this disparity is really stark when it comes to education. So if a goal is to engage women in the digital economy, education is a really important place to start, because that is something that all citizens at this point are really exposed to. So if there is technology in schools, then that's where you're starting to see familiarity with the internet to begin with. And so doing that perhaps earlier and perhaps for longer, we see that just that familiarity can really help people build that confidence in actually engaging with it. So moving on to education, education is important. Again, we just saw with the internet, but also when it comes to employment. And as we saw at the beginning of the presentation, that the women who are housewives, who self-identify as housewives, are just more likely to be in a more economically precarious situation than women who primarily identify as employed or self-employed. And women who are employed or self-employed are much more likely to have a higher education. And this likely stems from education at the beginning. So education is a first step in gaining employment. in gaining higher employment as well. You know, jobs that we traditionally think of as white collar, as better paying, require higher education. So engaging women in education provides a pathway both to jobs generally, but also specifically jobs that interact with the internet if they want to work from home, start engaging with the digital economy on that front. And overall, again, we find there is broad support for university level education. So we specifically ask about university level education since most countries engage, there's, you know, the norm is for everyone to become educated at the beginning, but perhaps there is a norm, again, in favor of sending males to university if that's what the economic situation is, only allowing a family to send one child or the other. But overall, citizens really disagree with the idea that university education is more important for men than women. And we see there is a gender difference here. There is a gender difference between men and women, but still overall in most countries, every single country, over half of the male population strongly disagrees or strongly disagrees that there's a gendered importance of education. And when it comes to women, when we're asking women, again, we see the differential in how educated women who are employed or women who are housewives tend to be. They both value education at equal rates. And we really see this across, this is one demographic breakdown of women across countries, but we see this pretty much in every different demographic breakdown we come up with, that women are on the same page, and that's that education is important for everyone. It's not more so important for men than women.
Thank you so much, MaryClare. Sorry, we're gonna have to interrupt this presentation here because we're very short on time. But thank you so much for all of the insightful presentation. Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Jamal. And maybe it's time for us to dive right into the conversation. Thank you so much. Maybe we can share this presentation later with the attendees or the people who registered for this event. I want to redirect this conversation, and before I start, let me just quickly introduce our discussants today. We have Dr. Tania Haddad, who is the Assistant Professor for Public Administration and Nonprofit Management at the American University of Beirut, and the co-director of the Global Engagement Initiative at the AB New York office. We also have with us Houry, who's a global leader in intersectional feminist network organizing, spearheading collaborative movements to achieve transformative change in gender equality. She's currently the UN coordinator of Unchained at Grasp, as well as the chair of the NGO Committee on the Status of Women. Thank you so much for joining us. It's such a pleasure to have you. And maybe we can start with Houry. Can you tell us a bit about your reflections on what you've heard from Dr. Jamal's presentation, and also MaryClare, and also one of the most interesting things that I felt was interesting was the fact that internet usage was dependent on employment and education. And if you look at this from an intersectional lens, it's a bit problematic. So maybe we can start with this and dive into other interesting things that have been discussed in terms of gender data.
Absolutely, and thank you all for having me here. It's quite interesting how I was reflecting on, because where I'm coming from, and especially in the 2 weeks that we're in the middle of the Commission on Status of Women, we hear a lot of global conversations and data, but obviously MENA region is a region that we need to pay more attention to. It tends, because it's a smaller region compared to Africa, Asia Pacific, Europe, North America. I think one of the most important things to mention is that human beings are the same everywhere. Cultural differences are present in any region, but there's something about the MENA region that really differentiates, because women identify themselves as someone that really needs to be more taking care of the home and, you know, education. Even if education is important, as we noticed in that data, that doesn't translate into leaving the home for work. And that really is unfortunate. And it's something that I think the key to all of to get out of this is really informing them what employment can mean to their children as well. Now, having said this, if you're not getting paid enough, I completely agree. How could you even leave the home? So I don't know if this is the time to really even bring in the idea of universal childcare, which is something that we're talking at the United Nations. Of course, that would make a huge difference to everybody across the globe. But for that to reach the MENA region, I think it'll be a while before that happens. But I want to make the connection to the digital, because that's exactly what we're talking about, and how digital has helped so many people educate themselves to get out of the situations that they're in. And if women who are not working or are separating themselves from the rest of the world, are not engaging digitally, then that really puts them behind even further. So I believe that is something that's quite important to bring into all, not just obviously in certain countries, but all of the MENA region, to make sure that they have access to it. And that's one of the things we're really asking for, because if it becomes universal, that everybody needs to have access to the handheld phone, Wi-Fi, then really we could surpass the culture part as well. Because countries have, if you agree on that, that's one of the things that we are so happy about being involved with the Commission on the Status of Women, because even though it's not mandatory, the agreements do translate to the ground. So women who are here from the MENA region, learning about their rights, can bring this information to the grassroots level, as we call it, from the ground up, to educate themselves, to say, hold on a minute, there's conversations about everybody having access to Wi-Fi and to technology, so that I can educate myself. So I can, because it really makes a huge difference. We all know that the minute we started connecting, Zoom, for example, and I'm also curious to hear a little bit more about what radio, I don't know if there was any conversations about that, because I was just at an event yesterday where I heard something that was fascinating, because as we know, in Afghanistan, education is not accessible at all right now. And this young woman said that when they found out that laptops were haram and radio was halal, she just basically switched her education into radio. And of course, the Taliban couldn't stop her because radio was fine for her. So I just wanted to bring that in and wondered if there's, because my whole goal is with my whole committee is like, how can we really creatively think to move the needle despite, patriarchy and the social norm? I'll stop here because I want to make sure to have a conversation.
I just want to circle back something, because I know you're going to have to leave in like 10 minutes or so. I just want to, so you mentioned the impact of having access to the digital sphere in general, and its importance for women to maybe regain their power by learning online or getting out of their situations through that means. And as we can see here, the Arab Barometer and research in general has focused on internet usage.
Yes.
For the most part, this was the main focus. Do you think this is enough? Or there are other research questions that we should focus on in order to generate data that can be used by feminist activists and civil society organizations that are trying to kind of bridge this gender digital divide?
Absolutely. And I'm going to pick from like what I was answering and just expand on it, because
Yes.
this is quite interesting. And again, that's one of the reasons we like to have these conversations with all regions and all levels, from the grassroots to the professional to the academic. Unless we know what it is that can shift the thinking of the housewife or the villager, and what is it that can actually, because what part of the problem is that they need to want to change as well. I mean, if they're happy in the situation that they're in, if that's how they grew up and it really is satisfying for them, it doesn't matter what data we show them, what we educate them in, they're going to be like, my priority is my children, my religion, and my husband, even if he's beating me up and not providing financially. This is what I'm familiar with and comfortable with. So how do we bring those conversations? And unfortunately, another thing we've learned is that it doesn't matter how experts are showing data. It really doesn't matter. The conversation needs to start in their own community. So one of the, again, a lesson that I learned years ago that was fascinating, I always bring it back when Africans were talking about FGM and how to really stop that, and UNICEF and all kinds of money was thrown into these villages to educate them. And they did not see a shift until they started convincing the village elder. They started with one elder that was trusted and who actually was making money by participating in the FGM process. When she learned that there's other ways of making money, and this is really not, and then the shift happened. So I think we have to figure out a way. This information is very important for us, obviously, but also to figure out a way, and that's when the activist movement comes in, where we can have networks of saying, how can we reach those villagers and start the conversation with them to shift? Because that's going to also then bring it back up to the goal of global.
Definitely, I agree with you. And maybe it's time for us to go into a shift to Tania and tell us a bit more about the interesting data that you heard from the presentation and what additional research questions we can think of for the next Arab Barometer wave or even future research in general.
Thank you, Carla, and hello, Amaney. Thank you for the presentation. Hope everything is fine, and thank you, Houry, also for adding to the discussion. Actually, three major things that were really that we should highlight in the presentation. First of all, is that gender equality is far from being achieved in the region. This is something that we all agree on, and something that we should move beyond. There are three major changes that should happen. The first one is the structural change, and this was also highlighted in the presentation. The care work, the education, technology, and this is something we started the discussion. Regional advocacy, to what extent regional advocacy, local advocacy can have a change. So we're bridging academia with on the ground, what's happening on the ground. So this is something we need to continue with. Cultural barriers. Cultural barriers are one of the major barriers that we're finding in the region, and this is something we're seeing on the ground. In a way, how can we change the personal attitudes? How can we change the mentality of the society? So this is something that we also need to address. And one of the major things that I would really like to highlight on, and this is something maybe for later on, is the care economy. So the care economy in the Arab world is unrecognized yet. This is something, a discussion that started also with the Asfari Institute. We started this discussion, the distribution of unpaid care work, changing in the gender norms. These are the things that I think we should highlight more, we should discuss more. And this is also has shown from the data that Amaney has presented. Most of the women are at home, they're staying at home, so they're providing this care for their family, and this care economy that no one is really documenting. So these are the things, these are the discussions that I think we should move on to.
Thank you so much. Maybe we can take some questions from the audience if anyone has any questions for the speakers, the panelists, or maybe we can see the Q&A. I see there are certain questions.
I got myself another 10 minutes.
Okay. We're running. It's okay.
Najib, I think you're looking at the Q&A.
Yeah. And if definitely, if Amaney or MaryClare, if you have anything to add, any reflections based on the discussion that we just had, feel free to jump in.
MaryClare, I don't know if you want to add because you were cut off in your, I mean, we went over, but I want to make sure if you want to have some concluding remarks that relate to what was said about the digital age.
Sure. Yeah, this presentation was specifically focusing on the digital age, and what we really found was access and education are really foundational for getting women involved in the digital economy. I also wanted to say we have information on where citizens get their breaking news from, and I know radio was brought up, and that is very important, especially to rural women in Mauritania and Sudan, which are, again, two places we saw have less or a lesser degree of internet penetration generally. So we do ask that compared to radio, television, and social media. And social media has been like drastically increasing over the years for both men and women, but especially the younger generation. So it is, you know, we're talking about MENA. It was brought up earlier that MENA needs more attention. It's a very specific region, a smaller region of the globe, but we do see these global trends really carrying throughout the world. And internet infrastructure is really something that is kind of lagging behind in the region. So to engage women there should be a lot more investment in that.
Thank you so much, MaryClare. I think we have a couple of questions from the audience. Would you like to go first?
My name is Mithaq from Bahrain. I would like to thank the organizers for arranging this event. It's a pleasure to be with you here. So my question is, if we want to change the world, we have to see education. And what are we educating young children? So in your opinion, what are the principles and values that we have to put in our education system to see the changes, let's see, 20 years, 30 years from today?
So we couldn't hear that clearly. Can somebody just paraphrase who's closer to the microphone?
Yes, so the question was, what are the principles and values that we have to put in our education system to see the change?
So in general, you know, it's always good for our educational systems to reduce to reduce the potential of the cultural barriers, like, you know, reduce the patriarchy. You know, education should be not only empowering to women, but should equalize the playing field a little bit. I often sort of say this really quickly that, you know, I guess I'm growing increasingly impatient with gender empowerment workshops that target women, because I think women know that they need to be empowered and women understand that they want to be empowered. I think we need to get men in the room. So that's what our educational system needs to be doing. And it started at a very young age, right? But I want to make sure I'm also emphasizing that to put the burden and onus on the educational system is assuming it's all about attitudes. And what we're trying to really also showcase here is that there's structural barriers, the labor force, the private sector, the incentives for women to participate. And these are tremendous economic problems. And again, they track well with all the other economic woes in the region. We still have some of the largest youth bulges of unemployment in the world. So our you know, families are taking out immense loans to educate their children and to educate their daughters, but they're not finding suitable employment in the labor force. So again, this is, I think, you know, I know it's tremendous, but then for the donor organizations, it's a lot easier to focus on the workshop to educate about empowerment than to say, okay, like Tunisia, right? We know that democracy was challenged in Tunisia because of the lack of economic progress. And again, so the economy remains a big part of the democratic empowerment, the gender empowerment, and getting more women to be able to afford even access to the internet.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amaney. I think we have a couple of more questions. Yes. And higher your voice.
I've been thinking, I mean, it's somewhat related to the conversation that just happened between Carla and Dr. Jamal, but I've been thinking a lot about how at CSW we've been having this kind of conversation about how we need to get women access to everything online, but then also about how online is a very dangerous and scary space. So I just keep feeling this tension between these two things that everybody's trying to advocate for. So I wonder if, I mean, the solution perhaps is that we need to rethink what this digital space is and what it means and how we use it at a conceptual level, which maybe will take some time, some, you know, values that are in our education. But then in terms of like how statistics, how research can help us achieve that. I don't know if any of the panelists or Dr. Jamal have thoughts on that. How can we use the data that we have, the research that we have to help us not only get women to actually rethink these spaces? How can data and research help us rethink this space? Is there any link between scare us? Yes, rather than scare us, exactly.
Dr. Amaney, were you able to hear the question?
Not, I think what I gathered is, if you don't mind, just the like this 2-second version is, yes, digital empowerment is very important for women in terms of human capital, but how can we ensure that that access is really not falling susceptible to all the other threats out there, like fake news and echo chambers and exploitation and yeah, and you know, I'll just step in really quickly. I don't know, MaryClare, if you want to add. So in a United Nations study that I participated in, what we found is that women who did not have access to education, or they had limited access to education, what we found is that when they had access to the internet, they were showing stronger signs of human capital. So there it seems to have been like almost substituting for some of the benefits that they were not deriving from education. So that's on that story. On the other hand, we also know, and here's what's becoming more scary, especially in MENA, that the internet has become increasingly a tool of political parties, of regimes to manipulate information, to sort of reinforce certain status quos. We know that there are a lot of actors who benefit from Facebook campaigns or other sort of campaigns that, you know, create diversion tactics. Like if you always keep people focused on the next crisis that doesn't have to do with the government, but only has to do with society. And, my mom loves to spend time on Facebook. And I gotta tell you the story she keeps telling me about. It makes me really, really worried sometimes about digital access, and we constantly are arguing about why does she even read these things. And I do believe that an older demographic, my mom never had a job. My mom was a domestic engineer all of her life, and I salute her and applaud her. But I do believe that, you know, these algorithms will target the more vulnerable populations with these campaigns. And that's something that it's not only in the MENA, this is in India and in Africa and in the United States and Europe. We're just beginning to sort of, we will be sitting here 20, 30 years from now saying, this was the beginning of the digital age, and here are all the problems that we did not see. So to that question, I am very nervous, and that's why as Dean of the school, I'm trying to invest in tech policy for us to better understand these problems. MaryClare, did you want to add to that?
I think in general, is the internet safe is just a hard question to answer. It's so broad. The spaces for both, I mean, there's the using internet for educational purposes, for trying to get information across, for earnestly, and trying just to socialize. So we do have information on how many hours a day people report, self-report spending on the internet, right? Which again is self-reported, probably a little underestimation. But really the bulk of our respondents, both men and women, are spending between 2 and 5 hours a day on social media specifically. So not just internet at large, but social media. They are getting news from Twitter and TikTok and Facebook. And they are also using the same platforms to become politically involved, or to follow news events. Specifically, we ask about, do you use the social media to follow political news? And we see those who care more about politics in general. We have a question, what is your general interest in politics? And those who care more about politics are also more likely to use social media for politics. So there really does seem to be a gathering of minds on these very narrow spaces. And there are there's a lot of pros, you know, organizing people who ordinarily wouldn't interact with each other. But again, there's also a lot of cons, a lot of fake news, a lot of distractions, like Dr. Amaney mentioned. So what we're really trying to get at is what people are using it for and how people perceive this. So I do think our data in particular is really useful for getting in the minds of, you know, just ordinary citizens. These are not experts. We are not targeting one class or another. So, but really seeing how people are perceiving the internet and using the internet, and that can really inform policy about how to, you know, make sure it is a safe space and promote responsible use of the internet.
Thank you so much, MaryClare. We're unfortunately running out of time. That has been a very interesting discussion. Thank you both for joining us today. We talked about women in the workforce. We talked about child labor. Sorry, child care. And we also talked about the importance of using these gender data and how to use these to inform policy. So thank you all for being here, for engaging in the discussion, and have a good day. Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you for having us. And again, sorry we couldn't be with you today. Bye.
Thank you, Amaney.
Thank you.
Very good.